The banner of the Abbasids read, "Leave is given unto those who have been wronged." Coming to you from deep in the hood, this is the Eurasian Century. Now I want to tell you a little story about what I think has happened in Israel Palestine. Bear in mind, this is how the conflict appears to someone who doesn't have a dog in the fight, at least not directly. And I'm not in love with either side. So that allows me to be more objective than most since I'm not always looking for black hats and white hats in the mix. At some point, the Iranians and Hezbollah and Hamas arrived at the conclusion that the time was ripe to force Israel to either accept a Palestinian state or to cease to exist as a Jewish political entity. They saw that Russia was winning the Ukraine war and that the West, America in particular, was weakened and decided that the iron was hot and the time was now. Saudi Arabia was working on a treaty with Israel, and this might lead to a stabilization of Israel's status among its neighbors that would work to the detriment of the Palestinian people, and given the U.S.'s involvement with Israel, would ensure that Israel would remain a thorn in the side of Iran indefinitely. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which, taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it arrives or lose our ventures. Shakespeare from Julius Caesar. So, the parties in the axis of resistance, which we discussed earlier in another program, axis of resistance is Iran, Iraq, Syria, Hezbollah in northern Israel or and southern Lebanon, and Hamas and Islamic Jihad in Israel, and you can make a case the Houthis in Yemen as well. Anyway, this axis of resistance decided to throw a hand grenade into the machinery and sink the ship and establish a new mechanism by which to effectively torment Israel into either granting a Palestinian state or into starting a war it can't win. I say can't win because, as I calculate the forces and dynamics, the power currently arrayed against Israel is sufficient to bring it to its knees, despite its nuclear arsenal and the potential involvement of the United States. The United States can't project enough power to help Israel at present. They can't even handle the Houthis in Yemen. American aircraft carriers are antiquated relics of an age before smart missiles and drones and hypersonic projectiles. They are sitting ducks, and their ability to inflict damage on militants is nullified by the subterranean fortifications utilized by Hamas and Hezbollah. Moreover, Israel can't use its nuclear arsenal without ensuring its own physical destruction and the death of most of its population of Israeli Jews. Iran has the missile capacity to destroy most of Israel's major inhabited areas. It also likely has a nuclear capacity, and both it and Turkey can obtain nuclear weapons from Pakistan per Pakistan's offer in the event of a major conflagration. What this means is that we're dealing with the difference between Israel folding up its tent and Israelis evacuating or surrendering to Arab rule, or, in the alternative, their extermination by Muslim forces. Those would be the two worst case scenarios from Israel's perspective, and they may have to accept the first one in order to avoid the second if they actually utilize their nuclear arsenal. So, and that was in those were what could happen if they actually use their nuclear arsenal. But nukes aside, America weakened and at a great distance, the armies and arsenals of Israel's neighbors are more than adequate to defeat it should its neighbors decide to intervene decisively. Turkey alone could field an army of close to 2 million men. Were it to undergo mobilization, it would have the largest army in the world, not just in Europe. We've already mentioned Iran's missile capacity. All of that would come into play in the case of a wider war, and Israel knows it. Um, as it stands, Israelis will have a hard enough time of dealing with both Hamas in Gaza, where Tzahal, the Israeli army, is losing men at an alarming rate, and Hezbollah in the north, which by its mere presence on the northern border of Israel has imposed a mass evacuation on the Jewish population there. They won't return until Hezbollah is effectively driven back beyond the Litani River, 40 kilometers from the border. So they don't have, and they've said that much. So they don't have to fear shelling and missile attacks, let alone invasion. So, realizing all of this, Israel is acting out, throwing a nasty tantrum because it realizes it is cornered and devoid of good options. Apparently, the knee jerk reaction of Israelis in this situation is to attempt to kill their way out. This is not likely to succeed for reasons we've already discussed, not only diplomatic pressure, but now economic pressure from the cessation of transport through the Red Sea accomplished by the Houthis, another member of the Axis. They like to call themselves Ansarullah, are coming to bear, and Israel will soon be forced to relent in its campaign of ethnic cleansing in Gaza. They may try to turn their sights on Hezbollah, but that will also work out poorly for them. They fell right into a trap because they wanted to. The Hamas attack was not of the nature it has sometimes been portrayed. Primarily, it was a very well executed military operation attacking military targets, bases, and personnel to inflict damage, gather intelligence about what Sahel knew about the Gaza's internal situation and informants, and taking hostages for trade for Palestinians that were languishing in Israeli jails. As far as I can tell, there were no beheadings, and I haven't seen any plausible evidence so far of rapes by Hamas soldiers during the incursion. And I could be wrong about the rapes, but I'm almost certain I'm right about the beheadings. Um, There were kidnappings of civilians, possibly by Hamas or possibly by tag alongs who followed them through the holes in the fence created during the initial attack. Many of the civilian deaths and casualties, however, were inflicted by Tzahal in their attempt to destroy and drive out Hamas from the settlements and bases they attacked. Israel has a policy called the Hannibal Principle, which sacrifices the lives of human shields in order to get to militants. Moreover, it is likely the whole attack was anticipated by Israel ahead of time and that Israeli forces stood down for the first few hours of the attack. This was probably the work of the Mossad, Israel's CIA, which does not like Netanyahu, the Israeli leader. The intelligence failures of October 7th are really only explainable not by some human error or technical glitches. There are various stories that are circulating about them not listening to women who were responsible for monitoring, and I heard earlier explanations, none of which people who actually, that I've heard people who actually worked for Israeli intelligence believe. I heard two of them early on say no, they knew exactly what was going on here. Wasn't technical glitches, but a conscious decision to stand down to allow Hamas to inflict some considerable damage, which would accomplish two things. It would justify ethnic cleansing of Gaza in their eyes, and hopefully in the world's eyes, and it could be blamed on Netanyahu, killing two birds with one stone. I've discussed the evidence for what I just mentioned in previous programs, but suffice it to say, a similar scenario played itself out in the Yom Kippur War of 1973. and was only revealed later by testimony made public in 2013. Golda Meir knew the attack was coming and allowed it without preemption in order to curry the favor of America, from whom she knew Israel would need to obtain armaments. This is not to criticize either Israel or Hamas for what has transpired, although I condemn Hamas for the initial attack, regardless of how severe it was. It's true that they didn't confine themselves only to military. They did attack civilians and kidnap civilians, and I have to condemn that. But just to give a bird's eye perspective from a somewhat disinterested observer, I am kind of spelling this out. I say somewhat disinterested because at the end of the day, what you're witnessing is a war between the two worldviews of liberalism, Western liberalism, and Islam. Israel-Palestine is simply a fault line, as is the Ukraine. So this is all fairly predictable in its broad strokes. I go on a lot about Samuel Huntington, but he predicted at these fault lines there was going to be perpetual conflict, or resurgent conflict, anyway. The details aren't as important as the fact that liberalism is undergoing a slow, agonizing death of 1,000 cuts. It is way overextended, and its adversaries now understand that thanks to the Russian pushback in Syria and the Ukraine, that America is in retreat, weakened, and a paper tiger, as the Chinese say, but with nuclear teeth. And so it must be exorcised, as in driving out the devil, with as little violence as possible, but exercised nonetheless. Though Russia and China are ostensibly remaining on the sidelines of this conflict, nonetheless Russia would like to see American influence in the region sharply curbed, and China would like to see the same thing, since that would stabilize the region for China's New Silk Road initiative, whose land corridor passes straight through the region. I'm not saying Russia and China are behind this little project of Iran's. I'm just saying that it is agreeable to them. The Houthis, who call themselves Ansarullah, Ansarullah means the helpers or assistants of God, by attacking Western shipping in the Bab el-Mandab, the strait that leads into the Red Sea from the south, are signaling on behalf of the axis of resistance that they could close the straits of Hormuz and Gibraltar if they so wished. Mandab is bad enough, and the rumors are that the Biden administration has contacted Iran, essentially pleading for mercy. The U.S. attempted a coalition of the will. I don't know if those rumors are true or not. The U.S. attempted a coalition of the willing to intimidate or attack Yemen, but this collapsed for lack of an actionable plan. Transport is being diverted around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, but this is costly. Time is money. Ansarullah wants a ceasefire, or at least a humanitarian pause for the influx of food and assistance to the Gazans. We'll see what happens, but the Axis has the power to interfere with shipping through Hormuz and Gibraltar, so we may see them turn up the temperature if Israel doesn't relent. We can't really address the pathology of what's going on. Now, it may seem that I'm going down a rabbit hole, but to dig deeper into what's going on, I kind of have to. We can't really address the pathology of what's going on in the Middle East without looking at the legacy and the aftermath of the Holocaust. But I want to bring up some effects of this that are overlooked or dismissed because I think they are endemic to the issues we face, not only in Israel-Palestine, but in the wider conflict between civilizations. Western society has lived in reaction to the Holocaust for almost 80 years now. I don't think that that's an overstatement, and that reaction is one substantial cause of Western feminism and effeminacy in Western males. But regarding the Jewish psyche, we must appreciate that the horrific evil that was inflicted upon the Jewish people and the consequent communal emotional trauma and scarring have resulted in the imposition on other non-Jews, Gentiles, of secondary effects. The state of Israel itself is one such secondary effect. AIPAC, AIPAC, the American Israeli Political Action Committee, AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, is another such secondary effect. But lastly, unfortunately, just as an abused son may grow up and abuse his own son, Israeli Jews, they and their ancestors, having been dehumanized by the Nazis, have fallen prey to the siren of dehumanizing Palestinian Arabs. They believe they have the right to do what no one in fact does by virtue of their communal scars. And this is a particularly unpleasant secondary effect of the Holocaust. I don't want to hit this point too hard because in other contexts it's been overdone, but here, due to the manifest nature of the activity in which the Israelis are engaged, I believe it is justified. Call it a sort of communal PTSD, if you will, but that may be what is behind their eagerness to use never again, the slogan they use as a talisman against the Holocaust ever repeating itself, as a club to beat the Palestinians into submission. Unfortunately for the Israeli Jews, their victims were not raised in a feminist society and are not inclined to sympathize with the pathos of the Jewish psyche. And that brings us to our next point. Adolf Hitler, the Third Reich, and the Holocaust left a monumental impression on the Western psyche which cannot be overstated. But the mental state of the West that emerged from the aftermath of World War II was inherently unstable, due to it having been unbalanced by the obsession to avoid Nazism and fascism. Part of the impression made was the notion that the right is inherently evil, just as the far left or Bolshevism, Maoism are evil. And so rightist politics have been scrupulously avoided in Western societies in the compulsive desire not to get burned again. But this is a distortion of the true political spectrum and, on the part of the well-educated elites who crafted it, a conscious one. Allow me to explain. Back in 1981, for example, there was a TV movie released that dramatized an in-school experiment a teacher had conducted in Palo Alto, California back in 1967. That is, the TV movie, it was an after-school special, or no, it was maybe an after-school special in 1981, was based on an experiment that actually was conducted much earlier, 14 years earlier, in 1967. This social studies teacher named Ron Jones, having taught a lesson on Hitler and the Nazis, wanted to impress upon his students how such a phenomenon could happen. So he made up a fictitious national movement called the Wave. Now, you couldn't get away with this today because of social media, and even at the time, it was sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing because evidently, contrary to popular belief, everybody kind of knew what was going on. But so he began to introduce certain behavioral reforms in his classroom and the school: dressing well, standing at one's desk when answering questions, hall monitors with armbands, and a club salute. Essentially, and this is the comical part of it, what he actually did was simply introduce good discipline into the school, perhaps with a few quirks. Now, allegedly, this prompted some of the students to start acting superior and exclusive about the club or movement. At least that's the way they were portrayed in the movie. What happened in 1967 during the original experiment is not entirely clear, and that's where the story gets murky. The fact is, what he introduced was completely innocuous. And it is a testament to fear of latent fascism in ordinary traditional practice that had possessed the post-war 1960s and even 1980s American culture. To him, and recall that we were talking about California in 1967, being well-dressed, being a member of a club with standards, standing up beside one's desk and answering questions, that was fascism to him. So discipline naturally led to fascism and abuse. It was an equation. He would lose his mind in any school in Asia or Eastern Europe. Also, what is completely left out of subsequent dramatizations are the actual parent and student reactions to the experiment in real time. During the 4 days it was conducted, which involved only three of his social studies classes, 500 parents complained to the school, not understanding the purpose of the experiment, and a small group of his own students, some of whom were either members or sympathetic to SDS, Students for a Democratic Society, and the Black Panthers, which were actually militant radical groups, actually kidnapped the teacher briefly and only let him go when he said he promised to end the experiment the next day and told him the punchline to him. I got a lot of this from a write up in the yearbook of the school, which I can give you a link to if you care to. I might put it in comments or description or something like that. But it's interesting to read. I mean, it it didn't even really measure as a speed bump much to the school, other than the parents complaining. But anyway, during the actual experiment, there wasn't really any secret as to what he was trying to do. In fact, he kind of advertised it. And it's no coincidence that it was actually filmed and released contemporaneously with the rise of Ronald Reagan and his morning in America, conservatism. Of course, you know the rest of the story. The teacher gathers all the students in an auditorium and says their national leader will be speaking to them. Then, just as they are getting restless, he pulls back the curtain and shows a big screen film of Adolf Hitler giving a speech in Nazi Germany. Shocks, tears, general discomfort, guilt trip extraordinaire, liberalism at its finest. But it just demonstrates my point. Authority and discipline equals fascism to these people. Incidentally, liberals tried the same thing, or a similar thing, again a few years later, in response to the Reagan administration placing Pershing 2 missiles in Europe, in Germany, actually, West Germany. That film was called The Day After, and graphically dramatized what a nuclear attack on the U.S. would look like. As a matter of fact, about 8.5 minutes of extremely graphic footage was stricken by ABC from the film as being over the top and unsuitable for prime time. Again, wild scare tactics, liberalism at its finest. But I digress. My point is that right-wing politics, or the right, has been libeled or slandered continuously, pretty much since World War II. In classical political theory, right and left represent proximity and distance from the monarchical concept. The original reference is to the French Assembly, where the royalist conservative members aggregated to the speaker's right, and the reformers and radicals aggregated to the left of the speaker. Thus, right and left, properly understood, only exist as a measure of proximity to or distance from the standard of monarchy, the Ancien Regime, or Old Order. So, the farthest to the right one can venture is monarchy. This has been twisted to suggest that beyond monarchy, to the right, lies Nazism or fascism. But this is inaccurate. And it matters, because left and right are primal impulses. And so if you believe that to the right lies ultimately Nazism, you will be skeptical and void any such political orientation or impulse. That is, anything to the right. It's perfectly necessary to avoid and condemn Nazism. But German National Socialism, Nazism being a nickname for the initial syllables of the two words in German, is not a creature of the right, but a distortion of the right. The problem with German Nazism and Italian fascism is that they take a far left notion and graft it into the rightist notion of empire or monarchy. The far left notion is atheism, or at least deism. Nazism and fascism, Nazism being what took hold in Germany, fascism being a slightly older version of the same thing that, or a very similar thing that took hold in Italy under Mussolini. They preserve the central authority of a rightist monarchy, but eject the spiritual dimension, the morality, the conscience. They do so because they are ideological children of the so-called Enlightenment, which taught that man is the measure of all things and that the voice of the people is the voice of God. That is, the Enlightenment is inherently atheistic or, at a minimum, deistic, since it relies totally on the wit of man for morality and spirituality. For those who don't understand or don't know what I mean by deism, deism is the idea that God is a watchmaker. He constructed the world and just leaves it alone. He programmed nature and does not interfere or have any interaction with his construct. Um, you have to project or postulate a hands off attitude for God or an absence of God in order to get to fascism or Nazism because you can't, the totalitarian nature of both of them means that the state and who's in charge of the state are entirely in charge of what morality is. Thus, essentially, Nazism and fascism had the same fundamental flaw in them as did Bolshevism and Maoism. All of these post-Enlightenment political philosophies had no moral compass other than the whims of the current leadership or clique. None. Of course, the same can be said of liberalism, and that is its fundamental problem. I recall being surprised to learn that such a supposedly stalwart conservative as George Will was an atheist. The conservative Scottish historian Niall Ferguson is another. But it makes perfect sense if you consider that American conservatism is not classical conservatism, let alone the Ancien Regime. American conservatism is conservative liberalism, and liberalism is inherently atheistic or deistic at its core and thus has no moral compass. This is a chilling realization when you appreciate the fact that America has engaged in wars in recent years, killing many hundreds of thousands of people, as well as having exterminated about 60 million of its own unborn, and by all accounts at present is veering toward measures reminiscent of police states like Maoist China. Liberalism has no more attachment to truth or the sanctity of human life than did Nazism or Bolshevism. Now, what the liberal powers that be in the Western world did to guard against any such metamorphosis as happened in Germany or Italy, at least in their own eyes, before mid-century, was to create American liberalism and American conservatism. And this is what they thought would protect them against fascism. As political constructs, they invented them, each of which had part of the answer to effective government, but which were designed to work at odds with each other so as to reduce the possibility that fascism, which they confused with classical conservatism, would reemerge. Their blindness on the distinction between fascism and classical conservatism was caused by, ironically, their atheism or deism. But classical conservatism isn't fascism, and in fact they, the liberals, are actually exhibiting the symptoms of fascism today. What they set up was a system in which a sun party, a dominant party, would be generous with the public purse, but permissive with the public morality. The other moon party, which they set up to be a foil to act as a brake on the zeal of the sun party, made it economically libertarian and relatively social conservative. Neither of them were allowed to be isolationist or protectionist, and so there was little difference in foreign policy between the two. Now, they considered themselves geniuses for having constructed this schizophrenic leviathan. The key to it functioning under the control of the oligarchy was to make sure that one party did not combine social conservatism and welfare economic policy. That would have thrown a wrench into the system and voided the new social contract. They believed that they had to keep the impulses of social conservatism and welfare spending at odds with one another to avoid a lurch to the right, which occurred with both Hitler and Mussolini. They were blind to the fact that they were treating the wrong problem. The problem was the atheism or deism, not the mixing of social spending and conservative morality. And so, at long last, they are falling into the same trap as the fascists and Nazis did. They have mixed market welfare states with coordination between government and business, but lacking a moral compass, that is, fascism. Thus, democracy is simply a chimera. or chimera. Um, the oligarchs control the public consciousness through the mainstream media and their puppet politicians. I'm not a small d Democrat in any case, but even if I were, what you have in America is not actually democracy, but an oligarchy that manufactures consent for its autocratic policies. Now, this false connection of the right and fascism has had other consequences as well. Western society lives in fear of the caricature of the abusive father or abusive husband. That this phenomenon lies in the wake of World War II, which was fought to subdue European fascism, is probably no coincidence. The identification of Archie Bunker, Adolf Hitler, and Donald Trump is natural to our society. Hard man bad, soft man good. This has led to bland white suburban culture, feminism, abortion, single parent families, no fault divorce, and the utter destruction of marriage and the family, along with all the baggage that such destruction brings, such as social pathologies, as high crime rates, for example, and low birth rates. Now, you may think that it is too much to say that all this is a reaction to the specter of one man, Adolf Hitler. Maybe. But he certainly did not do the patriarchy any favors. And whether coincidentally or not, it was after he made a splash that men were increasingly characterized as toxic in overcompensation for alleged past offenses. Jimmy Stewart and Henry Fonda became the male ideal. So it is no wonder that you see the mommy society of the West, in the person of Israel, fighting against the daddy society of the East, the Islamic Ummah. It is no wonder that you see the cross-dressing Zelensky fighting for Western LGBT freedom against the masculine image of Putin. And it is no wonder that you are seeing the Golden Dawn persecuted by lawfare in order to prevent him, Big Daddy, from taking over the mommy society. Does it all start to make sense now? Men in Eurasia and the global South, and many in the West as well, are in the process of decisively rejecting the Western liberal elite's redefinition of good and evil, which is fashioned to stigmatize masculinity as toxic. If you find this program valuable, please hit like and subscribe. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.